This video is about a topic that's important enough to me that I think I could honestly say if I made a new video trying to answer the same question once a year every year, I'd probably present a significantly different answer as each year goes by. And that's not because my own philosophy of life is changing. Now at age 39, I feel that in many ways my philosophy of life is quite consistent, whereas it wasn't if you compare what I believed at age 16 to what I believed at age 19 and so on. But I got a question from Adrienne. Adrienne is not just an internet acquaintance. She's actually been a collaborator on this channel. She's appeared in several videos here. When I talked to her a couple of years ago, she was just switching her major to be human rights. And she wrote to me now, a couple days ago, asking if I basically had a reading list I could offer, if I could offer her encouragement about what to read in now switching her major from human rights into political science. And she said something to me that's quite intelligent, but is almost verbatim something I've said many, many times to many other people. She said that her problem with the way politics is being taught in her university, in the Department of Human Rights, was that the professors were neither teaching facts nor methods, not teaching you how to research things, not teaching you how to come to conclusions. The professors were teaching what she ought to believe. Teaching what you ought to think is different from teaching the truth, teaching the facts, teaching the way things are. And she had various examples of this. Now, that's a huge problem in the teaching of politics. It's an even greater problem, you can imagine, in the teaching of religion. So very, very often I was involved in Buddhist studies. I was a scholar of Buddhism for more than 10 years. The fundamental problem I had with other scholars in the field was that they would tell you what you ought to believe, and they would not tell you what the text actually said. If you're talking about interpretation and translation of an ancient text, they would not tell you historical circumstances, historical facts, etc. Very often they'd be telling you something that's quite incompatible with those things. So I would say that is really a religious mentality that can be found within politics. And I don't think it's too much to say those are people taking a religious attitude towards teaching political science in universities. Now, let's play devil's advocate here. You can sympathize to some extent. These university professors are probably aware that some of their students are racist, and they want them to not be racist. They're aware that some of their students maybe are conservative bumpkins, and they think that this is a special opportunity for them coming into a university classroom to adopt what are perhaps cosmopolitan and sophisticated attitudes, and they're trying to inculcate those attitudes in their students' minds. However, this is fundamentally a condescending and indeed evil attitude for an educator to have. You should never teach your students what they ought to think. You have to provide them with methods, so that they can perform original research. If we're talking about university level education, the heart and soul and body and mind of university education is original research, period. So if it's not about original research, then it ain't about a goddamn thing, and it shouldn't be in the classroom. So you're equipping them to perform original research, and you're showing them examples of what original research looks like and nothing else. And you've got to deal with those things, even when they're unflattering to your political agenda, even when they might favor politically incorrect or politically inconvenient things. So it was an interesting thing for me to hear back from Adrienne several years after the first video I made with her, that she's switching into political science because she's hoping to deal with an end of, political philosophy that's dealing more with reality. And she felt that things over in her Department of Human Rights were a little bit too unreal. So this is the fissure between teaching how the world ought to be as opposed to studying the world as it really is. And the problem is, it's not just professors in the classroom that have this attitude of telling you what you ought to believe, not informing you about facts, history, methodology, etc. This is also a tremendous corrupting influence in the textbooks you'll be able to work with as a student. History books of any kind. But in general histories are the worst. The less specific and less analytical and less incisive a history textbook is, or a political textbook is, the more it tends to become propaganda. This is a huge problem in Western culture. It's a problem in British culture. It's a problem in American culture. It's a problem in Russian culture and French culture. But even within Western countries, once you get more familiar with political science textbooks and history textbooks, you'll also see that there are really culturally specific ways in which those authors are misleading their audiences. The way a British author writes about history is actually significantly different from the way a French or American author generally will. And I think many of those differences are unexamined, i.e. the authors themselves are not aware of the stylistic and methodological choices that they're making. You can even see that in the organization of books on history and politics. But so the first piece of advice here, and a younger person asking me for a reading list, which of course I'm not really going to give you. I'm going to give you advice about how to read and what to read when building yourself up as an expert in politics. The best way to avoid that type of bias, the unbelievable and really horrifying bias that's built into political science textbooks and general works of history, is actually to read first-person sources that openly declare their bias. So one of the books that really crystallized my thought about this when I was in my first year of university, and by the way, at that time I was not scholarly at all in my habits. I was working an exhausting full-time job at Starbucks. So I was waking up at strange hours and going to sleep at strange hours, because some days Starbucks would open at 6 a.m. I'd have to be there at 5:30 or something to open the store, and some days it would close at midnight. So I was really exhausted. But among the little bit of reading I did in that first year at university, as I recall, was the autobiography of the ambassador to Spain during World War II and the years just leading up to World War II. And I remember what a shocking contrast this was. And of course, everyone likes to lie about World War II. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why people write, emotionally impassioned, distorted versions of the truth about World War II. They're such extreme events for the people involved with them, and even for the people who are looking back 50 years later and writing about them. But wow, the position of Spain in the Spanish Civil War, at the end of the Spanish Civil War, and then the beginning of World War II, very, morally murky, diplomatically complex situation. What was Spain's relationship with the United Kingdom, with France, with Germany, and how did this change year by year? Even, what was Spanish fascism and its relationship to German fascism? And I remember just having this tremendous feeling about the difference. I was reading here, I think it was the British ambassador to Spain, first-person account of what the issues were. And of course, it was much different in terms of the pragmatic struggles involved. Like, in that account, it was talking about the struggles of the different governments to gain access to and control over particular metals and particular minerals that were suddenly very scarce at trying to produce tanks and armaments for World War II. I thought, wow, none of these other books mention anything about that. And then there were political and diplomatic aspects of that. Germany was trying to secure access to Spanish wolfram. Wolfram's the name of a mineral used in hardening steel. And the British and other concerns were trying to prevent the Germans from accessing this mineral. So it was a peculiar situation. But above all else, this was a book written in the first person. This was a book written with the words, I was doing X, I did this, I did that. And that was indeed a tremendous contrast to what you'd get coming out of any kind of history textbook or analytical work in political science. So that was one thing that refreshed me. The book I've read most recently before making this video was an autobiography written in prison, actually house arrest, not prison, by the former Prime Minister of China called Zhao Ziyang. Zhao Ziyang. So Zhao Ziyang was Prime Minister of China, and in the events of 1989, especially the Tiananmen Square massacre, he was kicked out of power and put into, again, you can say prison, you can say house arrest or what have you. And he writes the history of that period of time from his house arrest. Obviously, he has a reason to be honest, but in some ways, of course, he has reasons to flatter his own role in history. He's writing about his own period as Prime Minister of China, or Premier of China. I think technically Premier rather than Prime Minister is the right title. But anyway, the quality and the perspective you get from someone who was in power, someone who was himself struggling with the different forms of competing influence inside the government. There's a tremendous qualitative difference, and there's also a difference in including these pragmatic elements. I mean, before I was mentioning something like metal shortages. Okay, so that's a pretty simple, palpable difference in perspective. But obviously, people writing from the inside, people writing from the first-person perspective, they'll also really give you a feeling of how government works, how state power operates, not just why things happen, but how they happen, or what alternatives were considered and why those alternatives didn't happen, and so on. So that's, a real window onto political science that I think will shatter your belief in the whole discipline and will change the way you regard histories written by academic outsiders, and will, I think, intensify your appreciation for original research based on primary source materials. Whether those primary sources are laws, a law can be a primary source, whether they're statistics, social statistics, whether they're direct interviews with witnesses to history, or whether there's some of this, an autobiography of a former prime minister in prison, or an autobiography of a former diplomat. That kind of reasoning, I think, is tremendously powerful. And it's a contrast to the problem that Adrian wrote to me complaining about. However, there's a caveat there too. If you read the perspective of someone involved in foreign policy, like a diplomat, or you read the perspective of a prime minister, like Zhao Ziyang, you are never going to understand how government operates at the level of the mayor, at local government, whether that's provincial government, county government, city government, mayor government. And that is tremendously important too. I'll come back later in this video. So this already gives you the first spectrum of reading I'm talking about it being necessary to do. First-person perspective reading, sort of from top to bottom, when you think about autobiographies written by prime ministers, witnesses and participants in history, and being aware that somebody at the top, someone like a prime minister, is going to view these things very differently from someone at the bottom. And of course, when you're reading those books, you need to be acutely aware of the ways in which the author is motivated to be honest with you, and the ways in which the author is motivated to be dishonest with you. They may be concealing crimes against humanity they've committed. They may be concealing, very real atrocities. However, nevertheless, you will probably find a type of incisive honesty in them that you're not going to find in general histories, official history, you might say, written from an outside perspective. And I guess maybe the most extreme example of this, a book I really learned a lot from and enjoyed reading, was actually the book called No More Vietnams, written by Nixon, Richard Nixon, the President of the United States. Now, Richard Nixon was a notorious liar. He lied about many things. But nevertheless, there's a lot of truth in that book. And even when Nixon is kind of being dishonest with you in blaming other presidents of the United States for the decisions they made, he tries to kind of shift a lot of the blame off of his own decisions and onto presidents of the United States who served before him, pointing out that many of the problems and mistakes were not his fault, they were someone else's fault. That nevertheless is actually really valuable information and really valuable perspective from someone who's really worth quoting in an essay or what have you. So even someone as dishonest as Richard Nixon, reading his autobiographical first-person perspectives on the history he was involved in, that he had blood on his hands from, is actually much more informative than a lot of the dishonest perspectives on that same history from the outside. So this is my first piece of advice, now over. The second piece of advice I have simply has to do with the geographic span of politics and history. I tried to debate this with professors back in Canada in our Department of Asian Studies. I think it's really, really important for every young person, it's important if you're old too and you've got the time, to just look at a map and ask yourself, have you done a research project on each of these places, each of these geographic areas? So, for example, the whole continent of Africa, obviously you could spend your lifetime just studying it, but that's not what we're proposing here. Do a quick Wikipedia reading about the history of Mali, M-A-L-I, Mali. And I think if you just look at Wikipedia history of Mali, you'll get the sense, wow, if I took a certain number of hours to read about history and politics of Mali, the whole history, so going back to the earliest records through to current politics today, I wouldn't just get an appreciation for the history and politics of Mali. I'd get a comparative sense of how Mali is unique, how it is different from other surrounding countries in Africa. I'd be introduced into the discourse surrounding this type of politics in the whole continent of Africa. Now, of course, every example is imperfect. If you just look at Mali, of course, it is not a representative example. I wanted to make a separate video about that. No example is representative in politics. You're not looking for this example to represent something other than itself. The history of Mali is simply important in and of itself as the history of Mali, period. You're not looking for it to represent the whole continent. but you'll nevertheless get a kind of introduction into the politics and history of the whole continent of Africa. And of course, there are parallels, however imperfect, when you look at the history of Mali and you look at the history of Sudan. Sudan and Mali are very far apart, but nevertheless, there are profound things they have in common. Now, I'd say that about Africa. I'd say that about the Caribbean. It really did influence me in life that I did a research project on the history of Haiti. Haiti is spelled with an H. Now, of course, studying the history of Haiti does not teach you the history of Cuba or even the history of the Dominican Republic or the history of Jamaica. But nevertheless, just doing one research project like that and try to do the whole history, beginning to end, I can definitely say that I have a kind of appreciation. I'm equipped with the basics where I can pretty rapidly relate to and understand if I start reading about political history of Jamaica or another Caribbean country from what I learned about Haiti. And when you're reading sources on the history of Haiti, just like reading sources about the history of Mali and Africa, you're going to get analytical and comparative statements about those other countries surrounding the region. So if you can pick one country, and again, even just starting with Wikipedia, and really do some research, find a pretext while you're in university, because I don't know how your university program is designed, to study, one country, its history and politics out of Africa, Central America and the Caribbean, South America, obviously, then for the rest, East Asia, Southeast Asia, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a tremendously important and tremendously powerful thing. When I was at University of Victoria and talking to my professors there, I would point out to them the enormous gaps in the curriculum they were teaching just as supposedly Asian studies, as a survey of Asia. So that's not even the whole world, that's just Asia. But I point out to them, do you realize that India is not mentioned in even one course? You don't have a single course mentioning or touching on all of India and Pakistan. How can this be Asian studies? This is ridiculous. You don't have a single course dealing with the Arabic world, so the Muslim world, but really talking about Saudi Arabia, and the Arabic world is smaller area than the Muslim world. You don't have a single course dealing with this. How can this be Asian studies? You don't have anything on the history of Islam, or nor the history of Buddhism for that matter, how this transformed politics of Asia. These are huge, huge issues. So yes, again, you obviously need to also pick some example of a country from the Arabic world and study that history too. But so I do think there's a geographic span here where you need to cover the whole world. And I'm sorry, but that's kind of the way politics works. If you don't understand everything, you understand nothing. If you only understand the perspective of a colonial power like England, you're never going to understand the perspective of India or Indonesia or even Japan, right? So there really is a sense in which I think every student of politics has to dig in and do that work, kind of continent by continent or region by region. Because again, Asia, if you just call it one continent, East Asia is very different from Southeast Asia, Central Asia, the Arabic world, or West Asia, the so-called Middle East, and so on. All of that, you've got to put in some hours so that you are equipped with these kinds of examples, with these kinds of case studies, and each one is going to deepen and broaden your ability to deal with politics. What I'm going to say next, so this is point 3 in this video. Depends on how we count it, point 3 or point 4. But anyway, this is the easiest part to preach and the hardest part to practice, which is the historical span of politics. It's very easy for me to say, look, you got to look at the historical span and make a checklist and read major works from ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the English Revolution, also known as the English Civil War, the French Revolution, Napoleon, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. We could add more to that list, right? And what about the colonization of North America? What about the colonization of Australia? You could add many more things. But it's easy to make a checklist of the sort of great turning points in the political history of the world, and then say to people, well, you got to buckle down and read representative works. Again, what is representative? Nothing's representative in politics. You can read a representative history written by someone who's pro-Napoleon, and it's not going to represent any of the very important facts from someone who is anti-Napoleon, let alone someone who actually lived through that period of time and is writing against Napoleon in the first person with that passion and that perspective of someone whose own friends and relatives may have been tortured to death by the Napoleonic regime, or someone who maybe saw the absurdity of Napoleon trying to recreate slavery, international slave trade in the French Empire after the French Revolution had briefly abolished slavery. These are big, big questions, deep issues, and deep sources of bias. So the issue of historical span as I say, this is easy to preach but tough to practice in terms of actually getting down to what people should read and how to cover this whole span: ancient Greece, ancient Rome, French Revolution, etc. As I say, it's not really the list of events that's hard. I mean, like, in a sense, everyone in politics knows that the revolution in China is this tremendously important thing in the world's history. But what have they actually read about it? And do they even know how to approach that issue, how to put together a reading list? The other fundamental problem here with my third point on the list is that the history of the world's disasters is not the history of the world. It's very easy to read political science as the history of crises and the history of crisis management. So I said before that I was going to come back to this issue. It's a tremendously important issue. I said before that you really need to be wary. You need to be concerned about the fact that reading the perspective of a prime minister or a president will not tell you how the mayor's office works. It will not tell you how the provincial office works, the governor's office, how local government works. It will not tell you about the normal workings of government, nor the judiciary, nor the legal system, nor the prison system, nor the police on the streets. And those things all matter in politics. They matter tremendously. But if you think about it, let's say I was talking to a student from China or Cambodia. I've lived in China and I've lived in Cambodia. And someone in Cambodia asked me for a reading recommendation. What can they read to understand how the police operate normally in the city of Los Angeles? How the police and the legal system and the prisons and the mayor's office, what's normal in Los Angeles? Not about, say, a riot. That's easy. It's easy for me to give you an example of a crisis, one of the race riots, like the Rodney King riots in the city of Los Angeles. There are movies and books about that. It's easy for me to present you with a crisis and crisis management. And on a larger scale, you can say that too. It's easy for me to recommend you a book about some particularly terrible event in the French Revolution, the Great Terror and mass murder going on. And it's much harder to find out how did that society work in between crises, in between revolutions, and this kind of thing. You see what I'm saying? So, and the same is true of, say, ancient Greece and ancient Rome. How did the society work? Not just its collapse. How did society work before the Russian Revolution and after the Russian Revolution, the various periods of communism? So this is, in a sense, the anthropological whole in political science. That political science tends to never inform us about the anthropological reality of how people live, how authority operates, whether it's the cops on the street in Los Angeles or how your life was actually organized and ordered and planned, living in China in the 1960s or living in Russia in the 1930s, under any of these political systems. Even today, I mean, do you want to know today, how really does a country like Saudi Arabia work? How does life work in Saudi Arabia? And there's no simple solution for this problem. I mean, I hope if somebody's watching this who's an educator, who's actually a university professor, this is really what you need to think through strategically in putting together a curriculum that covers these bases for any one of these countries. I think you need to cover these bases even if you're teaching politics of Canada, but almost nobody makes that kind of effort. Nobody makes an effort to include the anthropological element. Nobody makes an effort to include the local government element. How does the mayor's office work, or how does it fail to work, and so on, let alone these other methodological concerns. So I say again, the history of the world's great disasters is not the history of the world. The political history of a crisis and then crisis management is never going to tell you how political authority operates in that country. I mean, you can look at a famous disaster like the Deepwater Horizon disaster. You can look at how the government responds to, for example, in Russia, the Chernobyl disaster. In Japan, there was this great nuclear disaster just a couple of years ago after a tsunami, giant wave from the ocean hit a nuclear reactor. If you studied that and you studied how the Japanese government responded to it, you still wouldn't understand any of these deeper systemic questions of fundamentally how does the Japanese government work, etc. Right? So this is the final warning I'm trying to issue in this video. It is both deep and broad. It's a very hard thing to become a well-read person in politics. And, one of the reasons why it's so difficult is that it's only after you have an advanced understanding that you can appreciate and even enjoy doing the kind of reading I'm recommending here. So I talked to my ex-wife on Skype a couple of days ago, And I mentioned to her, I said to her, oh, I'm reading this book, the autobiography of Zhao Ziyang, the autobiography of this former prime minister of China who ended up in prison, I was telling my ex-wife this because I remember she used to own a copy of the book. I never read it back when she had a copy. I just bought a copy and read it. And it was really surprising to me because my ex-wife, who was a PhD in anthropology, she said that it's true, she used to own the book, but she really couldn't get into it. She couldn't enjoy it. She couldn't get past chapter 1. And so she had never really read much of it. She'd only read a few pages or something. She found it alienating or hard to understand. And to me, that same book is really fascinating and really rewarding and seems self-evident to me how important it is to read. Another example is Thucydides. So Thucydides is an historian from ancient Greek, but his work is very political. It's very important for political philosophy. I can tell you about how moving and meaningful it is for me to read Thucydides, for me to read politics from that perspective and that tradition. But at the same time, when my own current girlfriend, my girlfriend's 25 years old, she asked me, about what you should be reading. We were at a bookstore together, and, Thucydides was there on the shelf, and if she should be reading Thucydides. And I found myself saying to her, well, I don't know if you're going to be able to appreciate or enjoy this book. I don't know if you'd find it interesting in the same way I'd find it interesting. I'm just standing there and thinking. And then it's very difficult for me to analytically unpack why it is I can relate to this book and enjoy it in a profound way, as well as why I find utility in it, why I find it so useful, in a shallower sense, as really instructive about politics, And it's difficult for me to think back, how would I have responded to this book if I read it at age 17, if I read it at age 27, So these things are all interrelated. As much as it may sound unrelated, these are all based on the school of studying human nature. And, in many ways, the foundational reading I did about the history of Haiti, the slave rebellions in Haiti, about Napoleon, about the failure of the French Revolution, these unrelated histories from other corners of the world, the reading I did about the history of Japan, about the wars between Russia and Japan. If you think about this, like pointillism, little points of information, really unrelated all around the world. Of course, the history of Cambodia, the history of Thailand, but the history of Canada, the Cree, the Ojibwe. Each of these interests, they really do inform one another in a profound sense. And the reading you do in each province of political science really does illuminate and deepen your appreciation for the reading you do in the other provinces. Reciprocal with this, your patience and your tolerance for bullshit, weasel words, vague writing, and your tolerance for propaganda passing itself off as political science, propaganda masquerading as real history. Your patience for these flaws in the literature will get slimmer and slimmer the older and better informed you get. So guys, as I said at the intro, this is an issue that's meaningful enough to me as a student and as an educator that I feel that if I made another video about this 1 year from now, I would make a profoundly different video, even though my own philosophy hasn't changed. During this last year, I've been a professor at the university level, 20 and 21-year-old students, and I did try to tackle some political and historical issues with my students. I was really trying to inform them about the history of First Nations in Canada. We did a bunch of lessons on the Inuit, also known as the Eskimos, but Inuit is correct. We're our people in furthest North Canada. And for them, as Chinese university students, they'd never thought about any of that stuff before. We talked about the history of racial segregation in the United States, many, many, many issues. Sorry, I'm not going to list them all. But actually, we did deal with some historical and political issues. And I was having to present that curriculum in a way that a 21-year-old student in China could relate to and understand, and where they also could do their own original research. Because, as I said, that's the body and the soul of university-level education, where ultimately it's not about me telling them what they ought to think or what they ought to believe. It's about me giving them enough information and then a really good question, because they're all being given question-based assignments, to go out and do their own research and come back and give a presentation in class. So my perspective in making this video today, unlike a video answering the same question 1 year ago or 1 year in the future, is partly influenced by the fact that I've just had this experience, not just as a student, but also as an educator. And in the year before that, when I was at the University of Victoria in Canada, I was talking to a lot of educators. I was having a lot of conversations with my professors at the university level. That many of them were very friendly to me and treated me to some extent like an equal just because of my age. And, they didn't talk down to me the way they might talk down to a teenage student. And I've got to tell you, it is really saddening that the types of questions I'm asking here about how to provide students with a meaningful, deep, and broad introduction to politics, whether the politics of Asia or the politics of the whole world, those questions are not being asked by professors in Canada today. I don't think they're being asked by professors anywhere in the discipline of political science. And I see many broader failings, it's a topic for another video, in the politics of the 21st century that do reflect the underlying weakness of political science as a discipline. Political science is a discipline with tremendous responsibility and that has the potential to make a tremendous difference in individual human lives, the students who sign up to study it, and also in the future of pretty much every nation in the world. And it's very saddening to see that almost nobody in the discipline takes that responsibility seriously. I would say that the whole discipline is much less interested in the truth, to put it as simply as that, than, for example, the discipline of history is, or the discipline of anthropology. So at this point, political science is at such a low ebb, is of such low quality, that I can openly say they have a great deal to learn from the discipline of history and the discipline of social anthropology. And one of the first things they're going to discover is the extent to which in the 21st century, political science as it is taught now is not a science. Pathetically, it is much closer to a form of religion.